Hello again, everybody. Nice to have this chance just to share again. I've come back to the same spot where I was standing 2 weeks ago. So if you haven't checked out the Easter Sunday sermon, you check it out. You'll see I was standing in front of this, it's called a clematis. And in the winter time, this is a horrible, scrawny old bush that kind of hangs out over our oil tank. But then it was just beginning to flower 2 weeks ago, and now look at it, look at all these gorgeous flowers, and there'll be more. It'll be a massive colour for in the next few weeks. And what I was talking about on Easter Sunday was the fact that that just represents what the resurrection does, that whole message of spring, of new life coming from old. And there's another bit of new life in the video today, because you see that box over there on the wall? It's a little bit dark. That's a bird box. We brought it from Kerry 5 years ago, and we hung it on the wall there. And this is now the fourth time that birds have used it, and just the last 2 weeks since Easter, a pair of birds, blue tits actually, have been busy building a nest. They were carrying stuff into that, and this week the eggs were laid, and as far as I know, Mummy Blue Tit is in there sitting on the eggs. So as soon as this video is done, we'll get out of the way again, and I'm sure there'll be chicks in a few weeks' time, so we'll be watching out for that. But you know, before this whole COVID emergency started, in church in Abbey Street, I'd just begun a series of sermons called Habits of the Healthy Soul. Now, we kind of broke off that for a while, because the last few weeks just been thinking directly about living in this lockdown time, living with COVID-19. But now, this morning, I'm going to come back to thinking about habits of the healthy soul. But of course, it's totally related. You'll find that I'm talking a lot about COVID-19 and our lockdown, because of course that's totally related with the habits of the healthy soul. Because the thing about it is, the fundamental thing I want to say today is that the health of our souls is not the same thing as the health of our bodies, or the health of our emotions, or the health of our feelings. Because you see, today our feelings might be fear, or uneasiness, or uncertainty, or exhaustion for some. We're so blessed with all those that are working so hard these days. Or for others it's boredom, because actually there's not a lot to do and stuck at home. So feelings are all kinds of things for all kinds of people, and they change all the time. But here's the thing, your soul is not the same thing as your emotions. You see, the world will say, the message we often get from advertisers and others is that feelings dominate our lives, and if we get our feelings right, then we'll be grand. And so the message comes across, just do what makes you feel happy and life will be fine. Or get your feelings sorted out and then you'll be okay. But that's actually a dangerous message, because feelings come and go. And sometimes they come and go for no apparent reason. I read recently of a survey that found out that actually only about 8% of the things that we worry about are actually legitimate areas of concern. 8%. Feelings come and go. You know, during these days of COVID, many are finding the Psalms to be very helpful, because the Psalms of all the books in the Bible are so honest in expressing the feelings of the writer. And there's all kinds of feelings. Every kind of human emotion is expressed somewhere in the Psalms. But when you're reading the Psalms, you'll also notice that while strong feelings are being frankly expressed, there's usually a deeper level of consciousness in the psalmist. As well as expressing their feelings, they also express a certainty and a kind of a centering in God's presence in their lives. Let me give you an example. Psalm 88. Now, if you read Psalm 88, to be honest, it's kind of hard going, because the psalmist clearly feels awful and there's no relief. Like verse 3, I'm overwhelmed with troubles. Verse 4, I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm like one without strength. Verse 6, you've put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Verse 8, I'm confined and I can't escape. My eyes are dim with grief. Verse 16, your terrors have destroyed me. Verse 17, all day long they surround me like a flood. They've completely engulfed me. So my goodness, Psalm 88 is not easy reading. But in the middle of all the expression of awful feelings of the psalmist, all through the psalm, those feelings are punctuated right through by the psalmist turning to God, even in the midst of the despair that he's feeling. For example, verse 1, Lord, you're the God who saves me. Verse 9, I call to you, Lord, every day. Verse 13, but I cry out to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. And so we see in Psalm 88, in the context of expressing their feelings, the psalmist is also expressing a certainty, like a centering on God's presence. In the middle of his feelings, it's like he's coming back to his soul is turning back to God's presence. Let me ask you a question. Today, most of us are locked up at home. So, watching this, you're most likely locked up at home. But here's the question, is your soul at home? You see, our soul was made to be in God's presence. So your soul will never find rest until it finds its home in God's presence. The way that John Ortberg puts it is this: the with God life is not a life of more religious activities or devotions or trying to be good. It's a life of inner peace and contentment for your soul with the maker and the manager of the universe. Does that sound good? It does to me. But how? Well, he goes on, we find it in the simple daily discipline of asking ourselves, is God here in this moment? If he is not, then he can be. Is God here in this moment? Then if he's not, he can be. So here's what I'm suggesting. Every time you hear a news bulletin and your heart sinks, turn your soul to God. Every time you have a burst of anxiousness that maybe I think we're all experiencing at this time, turn your soul to God. Because you see, we no longer live in the Garden of Eden. And so we regularly forget that God is right here with us. But then we so often forget that, and so we go on with our life without him. God invites you to let your soul rest in him all day, every day. We all get worried and upset sometimes, don't we? Not just in these times of COVID-19, but maybe especially these days. All kinds of worries floating in our heads all the time. How will this lockdown affect my children? Are my elderly relatives and friends who I can't visit, are they okay? Will I have a job to go back to after this? Or for some, the worry is, I have so much extra work to do these days. So all kinds of worries and anxiousness going on in our head. And at times when we're worried and anxious about something, we can end up carrying that concern all day, just letting it churn around in our heads, making us feel agitated and upset. And furthermore, that churning anxiety distracts me from God's presence, the awareness of God's presence in my life. Sometimes we're worrying uncontrollably, even without realizing that we're in a downward spiral. But God doesn't want us to be in a spiral of worry and anxiety. God doesn't want us there. So whenever we realize we've been worrying about something, we need to address that. God invites us to address that. But the solution to worry and anxiety isn't to try harder to stop worrying, because that won't work. If you're worried about something, you say, oh, I'm going to try not to worry, that won't work. The best thing we can do when we realize that we're worrying is to invite God into that worry, to sit ourselves at his feet. You know, on Tuesday evenings in our Bible study on Zoom, we've been looking at Paul's letter to the Philippians. I chose that letter because Paul wrote it while he was in lockdown. He was under house arrest in Rome. He'd been arrested in the prime of his ministry, taken to Rome, and he was now under house arrest, being guarded by soldiers of the palace guard, waiting for trial before the emperor. So Paul was in lockdown, under house arrest, and he had lots to worry about. His future didn't look good at all. And yet in chapter 4 of Philippians, Paul talks about dealing with anxiousness from lockdown. Dealing with anxiousness when you're in lockdown and when you're worried about the future as well. In verse 6 of chapter 4 of Philippians we read, do not be anxious about anything. How can Paul say that? That's great. How can we not be anxious about anything? We just do worry so well, don't we? And yet, remember what I've just said about where Paul was. He wasn't living in some dream world. He had every right to be worried and anxious himself, but he writes, do not be anxious about anything. But then the rest of verse 6 begins to answer the question as to how he can say that. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Again, it's that moment, that key realization that in all we do, wherever we are, God is there. However we feel, God is there. And that means that no matter when and where we come to Him, He is listening. He is inviting us to present to Him what's on our minds, to involve Him in what's on our minds. You see, whatever the problem is, we have the opportunity to place it in the hands of the one person in the universe who can deal with every threat. Now, actually, in the Bible studies on Tuesday nights, we haven't got to chapter 4 yet. So I've gone a bit ahead. And in a few weeks' time, when we get to chapter 4 in the Bible study, we'll dig more into the detail of that verse. But for now, just hear the basic message. Turn your anxiousness into prayer. Sit at God's feet instead of running around in a circle in our minds. And then verse 7 goes on, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. See the way it says, will guard your hearts? That's because in the original language, the word used there was a word which referred to a military soldier, a guard, a sentry, standing at the gates of a palace or on guard. Now, remember what I said a minute ago when Paul was writing this? He literally had soldiers standing at the door, not letting him escape. It was the palace guard, elite Roman soldiers. They were guarding him, literally, while he wrote that the peace of God was guarding his heart. And notice that that promise of peace is given irrespective of whether the prayers in the previous verse were answered by God saying yes. You know, the thing is, he said, don't be anxious about anything, but present it all to God, and the peace of God will guard your heart. And the thing that caused the concern and the anxiousness may still be there, but God's peace will put it in context. God's peace will be powerfully at work in our hearts, whether or not the source of the worry is removed. And notice that it says that this peace is in Christ Jesus. This peace is because when we turn our souls to God, then our souls are at home. And no matter what's going on in our world, no matter what's going on in our thoughts, no matter what troubles we face, no matter what anxiousness we're dealing with in our minds and in our lives, our soul is at home. And our soul is rooted in God's presence. And that offers us a peace that guards our hearts and that then pervades and changes the way that we experience our worries, changes the way that we deal with our feelings. And then the last verse in this passage I'm going to mention today is verse 8 of Philippians 4. Whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. The English words think about don't really fully translate the Greek. Paul's talking more about just sort of casually thinking about stuff that's pure and good and right. His point here is that thoughts are not enough. The Greek word really means continually focus your mind, center your mind on these things, and allow them to shape your conduct. So kind of back to where I started with that question. Let me ask you that question again. You're locked up at home, but is your soul at home? It's about centering on Him. Your soul was made to be in God's presence, so your soul will never find rest until it finds its home in God. So center on Him. Focus your mind on God, who is true and noble and right and pure. You know, of course, all sorts of things are in our minds these days, and sometimes as we watch the news, it doesn't help our anxiousness any. And it's important to keep up with government announcements, important to keep up with the news, but do you ever find yourself kind of overdoing it, watching the news every 10 minutes, what's the latest development? That doesn't do you any good. It's about, yes, check out the information, but there's time to turn off the news and just let your soul find its home again in God. Because then that puts the news in perspective. Then we're reading the news with that peace of God guarding our hearts. Then we're facing into the worries of the day with that peace of God guarding our hearts. Your soul was made to be in God's presence, so your soul won't find rest until it's at home. You're locked up at home now. Is your soul at home? Let's, during this lockdown, make sure that during the day, every day and all day, we recenter on God and let our souls be at home. So that as we face the worries and anxiousness of the day, that the peace of God would guard our hearts. Grace and peace. Amen.